Oh, he's home.
There he is. Yeah, welcome home, Julian.
Okay, if you're just joining us, this is Julian Assange's plane, which has touched down.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange returned to his native Australia Wednesday as a free man. In a deal brokered by the Justice Department, Assange pleaded guilty to a single felony charge for publishing U.S. military secrets.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary step in what has been a prolonged legal saga for Julian Assange. He left Belmarsh maximum security prison on the morning of 24th of June after having spent 1,901 days there.
His arrival home ends a long-running legal process. A plea agreement between Mr. Assange and the United States Department of Justice was accepted by a US court in Saipan earlier today.
Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, the saga of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has come to an end. For now, at least. It's been going on for so long, most of us have lost track of this extraordinary story. It started in 2006 with the establishment of a platform for leaked secret documents, Assange's WikiLeaks. In 2010, he leaked nearly 500,000 documents about America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, raising the ire of much of the Western world. That kicked off 14 years of legal battles, sexual assault allegations from Sweden, 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and a further 5 in a high-security British prison. Amid all that, he got married, had 2 kids, and attracted high-profile fans including Lady Gaga and Pamela Anderson.
He does not deserve to be in a supermax prison. He has never committed a violent act. He's an innocent person.
And became the center of a storm over whistleblowing and its consequences. Anton Nilsson is a reporter with the Australian news outlet Crikey. He's been covering the story both in Australia and in Sweden. I asked him to give me a brief rundown of what happened last week.
There was kind of a surprise plea deal all of a sudden, and seems to have been a lot of behind-the-scenes work by his lawyers and the US and the UK and the Australian government to make it happen. And he all of a sudden was heading towards the Northern Mariana Islands in the Pacific to front a judge and plead guilty to 1 count and was allowed free.
Why was it in the Mariana Islands?
So Assange had refused to step foot in the continental US. It seems like he and his supporters were afraid of what might happen if he had to go to the US. And I guess going to a US territory might have been a compromise they could both agree with, because he needed to see it. He needed to go in front of a US court, but he didn't want to step foot in the US proper. So that's the solution they came up with.
Okay. You wrote an article in March that said, I'm quoting, "Reports of a potential U.S. plea deal has raised hopes Julian Assange could walk free. His Washington-based lawyer says it's a long shot." So this was a surprise even to people who were following the case quite closely.
Yeah, it was. So we've heard rumors of plea deals from time to time. So the first serious one in the last few months was last August when the U.S. ambassador to Australia, Caroline Kennedy, she hinted at a possible plea deal. And then in March, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. Justice Department was considering whether Assange could plead guilty to a reduced charge of mishandling classified information and avoid setting foot in the U.S., which is pretty simple to end up happening. But at the time, Assange's lawyers were downplaying that and not really giving much in terms of confirmation. And if you've been following it for a while, you would have heard, stuff like this from time to time. So it seemed like perhaps a bit hopeful, but at least I didn't expect that it would happen so soon after. And then the next thing that happened was that in April, Joe Biden said that he was considering a request by Australia to drop the charges. Mm-hmm. And now that he's been released, the White House has said that they had nothing to do with it. It was all the Justice Department.
The plea deal that allowed Julian Assange to land here as a free man was organized by the Justice Department, not by the White House. And that's according to officials. But lawyers for Assange say they will be seeking a pardon from President Biden, Jeff. That's because they're calling his prosecution a criminalization of journalism.
Tell me a little bit about what happened in court there. So he pleaded guilty to espionage, is that right?
He pleaded guilty to conspiring with Chelsea Manning to unlawfully obtain and disclose classified documents relating to the national defense. That's from the Justice Department media release. And it had to do with the diplomatic cables that WikiLeaks released in 2010.
What's the general feeling about Assange in Australia? And has that changed over the years?
You see, in Australia, it's basically been a pretty constant issue. And if you walk around in a city like Sydney, you quite often see graffiti saying "Free Assange," and it hits the news from time to time. I think probably Australia is one of the places where it's been the most consistent in terms of news coverage. I think a lot of his supporters in Australia probably view him as similar to other detainees abroad that shouldn't be in jail and should be free.
And now what about in Sweden? Is the sentiment a bit different there? Does the general public in Sweden look at the issue a bit differently due to what the charges were there, those initial charges?
I wonder if they do. It's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer to that, to be honest with you. When he was initially accused of crimes in Sweden, which was very shortly after the diplomatic cables were released in 2010, he made the news a lot. But I wouldn't say it's been a constant media issue or anything, but I reckon the Swedish media has been very interested in it when something has happened.
Okay. Let's take a step back to the beginning. WikiLeaks launched in 2006. Was it a big deal at the time?
I don't know if the launch was huge news, but the real big story started in 2010 when they started releasing diplomatic cables, which are messages between embassies and the US government, basically. And in 2010 and 2011, they ended up releasing more than 250,000 of these. And that's when everything really kicked off.
WikiLeaks has published more than 90,000 US military documents in a coordinated release with the New York Times, The Guardian and Der Spiegel in Germany. The massive pile of classified material is being described as one of the biggest leaks ever of US military intelligence. It reveals details of the war in Afghanistan and the NATO allies' relationship with Pakistan.
What was the international reaction to that?
There was a huge international reaction because the messages were written by US diplomats around the world, intended for American government officials to read. So they pertain to all kinds of governments everywhere, and there were embarrassing details about all kinds of famous politicians. So I think in a lot of countries, there would have been a lot of local stories. It would have garnered a huge interest in a lot of countries, including in Australia and Sweden. But in the US, it was obviously a huge deal because of the government felt that it was a huge violation of their information and ability to do diplomatic and foreign policy work.
What was the big deal for the US in that, or the biggest deal?
One of the biggest revelations was a video that was dubbed Collateral Murder, which showed US forces firing on a group of civilians, killing several of them, including 2 Reuters journalists.
The disturbing video was posted on the internet today by WikiLeaks, a whistleblower website. And it shows graphic gun camera images of a U.S. helicopter attack in Baghdad in July 2007. The aerial assault plays out over 40 minutes with an Apache helicopter pilot, call sign Crazy Horse 18, repeatedly requesting permission to fire on a group of men he believes to be insurgents.
You're clear. All right, firing.
The Apache and a second gunship open up with machine guns as the men on the ground try to flee. A short time later, they ask again for permission to fire.
Come on, let us shoot. Come on.
More than a dozen people were killed. It's believed that 2 Iraqis working for the Reuters news service were among the dead.
That was a huge deal at the time. There was also information about how the U.S. had ignored torture in Iraq by troops. There were leaked conversations that indicated that the U.S. had ordered diplomats to spy on the United Nations Secretary General. And there was information about the EU having kind of adverse thoughts about the Afghanistan war. So all of these things that had to do with the Iraq and Afghanistan war made a huge splash at the time.
Okay, so then the legal battle starts, but it didn't start with anything to do with WikiLeaks, right? What were those initial charges?
So in 2010, at the same time as these leaks were happening, so the leaks were kind of being doled out over time.
Mm-hmm.
In the middle of all that, Assange went to a WikiLeaks conference in Stockholm, and he was accused of rape by a woman and sexual assault by another one.
A British magistrate has ordered WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange be extradited to Sweden to face allegations that he sexually assaulted 2 women. His lawyers claim the rape charges are politically motivated and he'll never get a fair trial.
Prosecutors wanted to question him about this. He basically refused to be questioned. So prosecutors at one point tried to bring Assange in so he could be questioned. And he at all times denied the accusations and refused to go back to Sweden to be questioned. He was arrested in the UK by police there on behalf of Sweden, let out on bail, and then he appealed a European arrest order, and that case went on for 2 years. Then in June 2012, he applies for asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
There's been an extraordinary twist in the Julian Assange saga, with the WikiLeaks founder seeking political asylum in Ecuador. The move follows his failed bid to avoid extradition to Sweden on sex crime allegations. He's now taking refuge in Ecuador's London embassy, where for now he's being offered protection.
And he remained inside that embassy until UK police entered it and arrested him in April 2019. And at the same time as that was happening, essentially, Assange was indicted by a US grand jury on a bunch of charges about violating the Espionage Act.
U.S. officials charged WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange with violating the Espionage Act on Thursday. The additional 17-count indictment alleges Assange and WikiLeaks have repeatedly sought, obtained, and disseminated information that the United States classified due to the serious risk.
Even though he wasn't in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. So he hasn't been in the U.S. Actually, I don't know if he's ever been there. I'm assuming he has. But Assange was in the UK at the Ecuadorian embassy when the US was beginning their prosecution of him. And at the time he had been arrested by UK cops and taken out of the embassy, they unsealed the charges against him. And it was 18 charges, including alleged violations of the Espionage Act.
So he spends 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. What were some of the main kind of news stories during that time?
So the Swedish prosecutors were continuing to try to advance their case all the way until 2017, which is 5 years after he entered the embassy. And then after he was arrested and taken out of there, they opened it again, and they finally abandoned it in 2019. And then in 2020, the statute of limitations kicked in. So that's when that ended. But while it was in the embassy, there were a few kind of strange stories that emerged. It was a fairly unique situation where he basically lived in an apartment in the embassy, and he received asylum by Ecuador. There were some videos released at some point where you saw Assange skateboarding inside the apartment to pass the time.
Well, a new Julian Assange video has now surfaced online. In the video, the WikiLeaks founder could be seen skateboarding inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
There were other kind of more or less bizarre tidbits coming out here and there. In 2018, Assange sued Ecuador for allegedly violating his human rights by refusing him phone and internet access and refusing him visitors. So his relationship with his essentially, asylum host was deteriorating. And over time, I think it became kind of a burden for Ecuador as well, especially when they changed government in the middle of his time there. And at the end, I don't think either side was very happy with each other. It's hard to say what actually transpired there, but it's fair to say that it became untenable by the end from the Ecuadorian point of view. And I think that's why they allowed the UK to go in and arrest him in the end.
Breaking just moments ago, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange arrested by British police after essentially being evicted from the Ecuadorian embassy there in London. Now, he's been holed up there since 2012.
That was in April 2019. The British police arrested Assange for failing to surrender to the court on those Swedish charges. But the arrest was also on a U.S. extradition warrant. For skipping bail, he was sentenced to 50 weeks in prison. And he spent that in London's high-security Belmarsh prison. But he was also fighting the extradition to the U.S., so in the end, he stayed in jail well past his sentence, more than 5 years.
He sat there until a week ago when he was put on a plane to Mariana Islands.
Okay, there's a lot of debate over whether he's a hero or a bad guy. What were some of the results of the leaks?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of debate about what the negative impacts might have been stemming from the leaks. Certainly the U.S. intelligence community and diplomats were very angered, and they suffered setbacks in their operations due to the leaks.
Okay.
In 2010, there were fears that people in places like Iraq and Afghanistan who had been passing info to the U.S. may have been exposed by the files. But by the end of that year, a Pentagon spokesman admitted to the Washington Post that the U.S. had no evidence of any harm that had come to anyone that was directly tied to the WikiLeaks documents. However, in the years since, journalists have found evidence of innocent people being harmed by other leaks. For example, in 2016, the Associated Press found that 2 teenage rape victims had been named in documents. Okay. A Saudi citizen had been outed as gay. And in the Democratic National Committee leak in 2016, there were people who were named in that who had sufficient information about them revealed that they were, threatened by identity thieves, not to mention the impact it had on the U.S. political scene, obviously.
But love him or hate him, he has had an impact on major information leaks.
Assange supporters have been really keen to frame WikiLeaks as a matter of press freedom and of Assange as a journalist. And there's been a debate raging about that for, 14 years now. There was a Guardian columnist who wrote last week that in some way it's a useless debate because it's obvious Assange has had a massive impact on journalism, whether you see him as a journalist or not. I'd argue that WikiLeaks collaborating with, legacy newspapers around the globe on sifting through huge troves of leaked information has inspired others to do the same. And if you look at the Panama Papers, for example, they followed a pretty similar model. Mm-hmm. And I guess WikiLeaks originally kind of saw itself as a challenger of traditional journalism, but pretty quickly became kind of a collaborating partner with certain newspapers. It's also probably fair to say that Assange inspired whistleblowers like Edward Snowden.
29-year-old Edward Snowden made a number of bold and unverified claims in this interview recorded in a Hong Kong hotel room.
I, sitting at my desk, certainly had the authorities to wiretap anyone from you or your accountant to a federal judge to even the president if I had a personal email.
He justified leaking the documents by painting a bleak picture about what could happen if U.S. intelligence agencies continued to collect and store the communications of Americans.
And WikiLeaks supported him as he was fleeing U.S. authorities after his leak. So I think he's definitely had a major impact on journalism, whether you agree that he's a journalist or not.
What's next for Assange? You think his family has said he needs some time to rest and recover, but he doesn't really seem like the type to just kind of go quietly into the sunset.
Yeah, it's hard to know. He did wave to the cameras a bit. He didn't show up to a press conference at his arrival, and his family said it was a private matter.
What he needs now, his family says, is rest.
He needs time. He needs to recuperate, and this is a process.
His dad has said that he will, he's just going to walk up and down the beach and feel the sand between his toes, essentially enjoy his freedom and regular life for a bit. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, there's no telling what he might do next, but I would be surprised if we've heard the last from him.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Today's episode was produced by Alexia Russell, Tom Kitchen, and Davina Zimmer. It was engineered by Mark Chesterman. Thanks to Anton Nilsson. I'm Gwen McClure, Matewa.